What drives a person to pick up an axe and end the lives of 8 innocent people in one night? The 𝐒𝐿𝐴xe Axe Murder House doesn't offer answers, only whispers, shadows, and silence that refuses to fade. It's just a small house in Iowa, a single-story white structure that could easily blend into any neighborhood. But once you step inside, everything feels wrong. June 10th, 1912. 𝐒𝐿𝐴xe, Iowa. A day like any other. A quiet town of just over 2,000 people, a place where everyone knew everyone. A place where doors were left unlocked, and families felt safe. No one could have imagined the darkness that would soon cast its shadow over this peaceful little town.
The Moore family was a picture of small-town perfection. Josiah Moore was a respected businessman who ran a local hardware store. His wife, Sarah, was deeply involved in the community and their church. Together, they were raising 4 bright, lively children: Herman Moore, Mary Moore, Arthur Moore, and Paul Moore. That evening, the Moores attended a Children's Day program at their church, where Sarah had helped organize the event. With them were Lena and Ina Stillinger, 2 young sisters who'd been invited to spend the night at the Moore home. The program ended around 9:30 p.m., and the group walked home together, unaware it would be their last steps.
Sometime after midnight, an unknown figure approached the Moore home. Did they knock? Or did they simply walk in? No one knows for certain. But what we do know is that this person brought an axe, an ordinary, wooden-handled tool, now turned into a weapon of unfathomable horror.
The killer likely entered through the unlocked back door, moving silently through the small home. First, they made their way to the master bedroom where Josiah and Sarah were sleeping. Josiah was struck first, the blade splitting his skull with brutal force. Sarah was next. By the time the killer was done, their faces were no longer recognizable.
But they weren't finished.
Next, the intruder entered the children's bedrooms. One by one, they were attacked as they slept. 8-year-old Herman, 11-year-old Catherine, 7-year-old Boyd, 5-year-old Paul. Not one of them woke up, their dreams forever stolen. Finally, the killer entered the guest room, where Lena and Ina Stillinger were sleeping. It's believed that Lena woke up during the attack. Evidence suggested she had defensive wounds, small cuts on her arms, and her body was found lying across the bed in an unnatural position. The violence she faced was even more brutal than the others. But just like the rest, she never made it out alive. By dawn, the home had become a silent tomb. That morning, Mary Peckham, the Moore's neighbor, grew concerned. The family hadn't been seen, and the house was eerily still. She knocked on the door, but no one answered. The curtains were drawn, and the barn animals had not been tended to. Mary called Josiah's brother, Ross, who arrived and let himself in.
What Ross found inside the home would haunt him for the rest of his life. 8 bodies. 8 lives taken in one horrifying act of violence. Blood stained the walls, the sheets, and even the ceiling. The axe, which had been wiped clean, was left behind, leaning against the wall near the guest room.
The news of the murders spread like wildfire. 𝐒𝐿𝐴xe was in shock. Fear gripped the town as families began locking their doors for the first time. Children were kept indoors. Suspicion ran rampant. How could this have happened? Who could have done such a thing? The brutality of the crime was beyond comprehension. The questions it left behind were even worse. Why? How? And who?
The answers would never come. The investigation began almost immediately after the gruesome discovery. The quiet streets of 𝐒𝐿𝐴xe were suddenly filled with lawmen, reporters, and curious onlookers, all drawn by the horrifying crime. But despite the urgency, answers were elusive. In those days, forensic science was primitive at best. There were no DNA tests, no advanced crime scene techniques.
The house had already been trampled by dozens of locals before authorities could even secure it, destroying what little evidence might have existed. Fingerprints? None were usable. Witnesses? There were none. Whoever committed the murders had slipped into the night, leaving only questions behind. But there was one clue: a lantern. It had been placed carefully at the foot of the stairs, its chimney removed to dim the light. It seemed the killer didn't want to risk waking anyone as they moved through the home. The axe itself, belonging to Josiah Moore, was left behind, wiped clean of blood and propped against the wall near the guest room. As days turned into weeks, rumors began to swirl. Was this the work of a vagrant, wandering through town? Or was it someone closer to the Moores, someone they knew and trusted? Two names would rise to the top of the suspect list, both surrounded by controversy and suspicion. Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher, was one of the first suspects. Kelly was known for his strange behavior, an unsettling man with a history of inappropriate conduct. The night of the murders, Kelly had been in Villisca, attending the same Children's Day program as the Moores. He even left town early the next morning, adding fuel to the fire. Years later, Kelly would confess to the murders, but his story was inconsistent and his mental state unstable. His confession was thrown out, and he was tried twice. Both trials ended without a conviction. Then, there was Frank Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman and rival of Josiah Moore. Jones and Moore had a bitter history. Josiah had once worked for Frank, managing his store. But when Josiah left to open his own business, he took valuable clients with him, including the John Deere account. The rivalry between the two men was well known in town. Some speculated that Jones might have hired someone to carry out the murders, a theory that gained traction when a man named William Mansfield, a suspected axe murderer, was linked to the case. But no solid evidence ever tied Jones, or anyone else, to the crime. As the years dragged on, the case grew colder. New leads would occasionally surface, but none ever brought answers. Theories ranged from the plausible to the bizarre, everything from a deranged drifter to a satanic ritual. Each idea seemed as likely as the last, but none could be proven.
And so, the investigation came to a standstill. The house itself seemed to keep its secrets, locked in silence. The Moore family and their guests were laid to rest, but the whispers of what happened that night have never truly gone quiet. As the case faded into obscurity, the stories began. Locals spoke of strange happenings inside the house, doors opening on their own, the faint sound of children's laughter, and shadows moving where no one should be. The Moore house wasn't just a crime scene anymore. It had become something else. Something darker. Something alive. For decades after the murders, the Moore house sat quietly at the edge of town. It was just an ordinary home, or so it seemed. But for those who dared to step inside, the experience was anything but ordinary.
The first whispers of hauntings began in the 1930s, as the home changed owners. Residents reported strange noises, footsteps creaking on the stairs in the dead of night, doors opening and closing on their own, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. But it wasn't just sounds. Shadows moved where no one should be. One family claimed they would wake to find chairs dragged to different parts of the house, as if someone, or something, had been watching them.
By the 1990s, the stories had grown darker. Paranormal investigators flocked to the Villisca axe murder house, armed with cameras, voice recorders, and infrared sensors. What they captured would send chills down even the most hardened skeptics. Visitors spoke of cold spots in rooms where the murders had occurred. Some claimed they felt hands brush against their arms or shoulders, though no one was there. One investigator reported hearing the faint sound of children laughing, followed by the heart-wrenching sound of crying. Others described hearing heavy footsteps on the stairs, as if someone was retracing the killer's steps.
But the most unsettling reports came from those who claimed to have seen him, the shadowy figure of a man, clutching an axe, roaming the halls in silence.
I stayed in the house overnight with some friends. Around 2 a.m., we heard footsteps upstairs, heavy, deliberate. We thought it was one of us, but no one was there.
I was sitting in the children's room with my recorder when I felt this pressure. Like someone was standing right behind me. I turned around, but nothing was there. And then my recorder picked up a whisper, a child's voice, saying, "Help me."
I swear I saw him. At the end of the hall. A tall man with an axe. He didn't move, just stood there. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, he was gone.
The attic is where many believe the killer waited, lurking in the dark as the Moore family returned home that fateful night. Even today, visitors report an overwhelming sense of dread in this space. Some refuse to enter at all, claiming the air feels too heavy, too suffocating. One investigator described hearing faint breathing in the attic while conducting an EVP session. When they played back the recording, the sound of labored breathing grew louder, followed by a single word, spoken in a low, guttural voice: "Leave." Despite, or perhaps because of, the terrifying stories, the 𝐒𝐿𝐴𝐿𝐴𝐿 Axe Murder House became a destination for thrill seekers and ghost hunters alike. Overnight stays are now common, with visitors paying hundreds of dollars to spend a single night inside. But not everyone makes it through until morning. Many have fled in the middle of the night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched or followed. What is it about this house that refuses to let go of its past? Is it the lingering energy of those who died here? Or is it something darker, something tied to the killer, who was never caught? Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain: the 𝐒𝐿𝐴𝐿 Axe Murder House remains a place where the line between the living and the dead feels terrifyingly thin. November 7th, 2014. What began as a routine night of ghost hunting turned into something far more frightening, a night that blurred the line between history and horror. Robert Stephen Larson Jr., 37 years old, had traveled to Villisca, Iowa, with a group of friends. Like so many before them, they were drawn to the infamous Axe Murder House, hoping to catch a glimpse of the unexplained, to experience the paranormal for themselves. They arrived with cameras, recorders, and the nervous excitement that every visitor feels when stepping into a place so steeped in tragedy. The group began their night as so many others had, exploring the house, setting up equipment, and sitting in the heavy silence, waiting for something to happen. For hours, they investigated. They called out into the darkened rooms, asking the spirits of the Moore family to make their presence known. Occasionally, they thought they heard faint knocks, or felt a cold draft brush past them, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Not yet. But as the clock struck midnight, the same hour the murders had begun over a century earlier, the atmosphere inside the house shifted. The air grew heavier, colder, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The group began to feel uneasy, though they couldn't explain why. Some described the sensation as being watched. It was shortly after this that Robert excused himself. He told his friends he needed a moment alone, retreating to one of the small rooms upstairs. They assumed he'd return shortly, but as the minutes ticked by, their concern grew. When his friends went to check on him, they found Robert slumped against the wall, clutching his chest. His shirt was soaked with blood. He had stabbed himself, deliberately, and with a force that shocked even seasoned investigators later. Paramedics arrived quickly and rushed Robert to a nearby hospital. His injuries were severe, life-threatening, but he survived. From there, he was airlifted to Creighton University Medical Center in Omaha, where he underwent emergency surgery. The story made headlines, sparking a wave of questions and fear. What had driven Robert to harm himself? According to those who were there that night, there had been no argument, no visible signs of distress before he left the group. So what happened in that small, dark room? Robert has never spoken publicly about the events of that night. Whether it was out of shame, fear, or something else entirely, he's remained silent. Even his friends could only speculate, describing him as not himself in the hours leading up to the incident. They spoke of an almost trance-like state, as if something had come over him. Was it the house? The energy left behind by the unspeakable crimes committed there? Or was it something buried deep within Robert's own mind, brought to the surface by the oppressive atmosphere of the place? And then, there's the timing. Robert's self-inflicted injury occurred just past midnight, the same hour the Moore family and their young guests were murdered over a century earlier. Coincidence? Or something darker? The 𝐒𝐿𝐴𝐻 murder house has always been a place of questions without answers. The crimes of 1912 remain unsolved, the truth forever lost to time. And now, the events of 2014 have only deepened the mystery, leaving behind more questions than ever. What did Robert see that night? What did he feel? Did he come face to face with the same evil that claimed 8 innocent lives in 1912? Or did the house simply reflect the darkness that was already within him? We may never know. Today, the 𝐒𝐿𝐴𝐻 murder house is a popular tourist attraction. It costs $428 a night to stay here. Visitors come looking for thrills, chills, or maybe even answers. But what they often find are moments they can't explain and memories they'd rather forget. More than 100 years have passed, but the 𝐒𝐿𝐴𝐻 murder house hasn't lost its grip on the living or the dead. The story lingers like a shadow. The house still stands, waiting, daring the brave or the foolish to step inside. Would you?